Hi, Harley here. Today in my travel log, we're going to be going to England. This trip was just a normal business trip, going over there to visit some customers, and I don't really remember the whole purpose of the trip other than I do remember I went to a number of customers over about a week's period or so. The trip did start off with a little bit of problems. I don't remember exactly what the issue was, but something happened on my flight and I missed my transfer in Atlanta, and so I ended up having to spend a night uh, there in Atlanta overnight. Airline put us up because it was their problem, but yeah, it was. I do remember I had a day delay on that trip, getting there. And the other part of the trip was it was the first time I'd been on a really long airline flight. I think it was 9 hours going across Atlantic and from Atlanta, and that was the longest airline flight that I had taken up to that point. And I remember getting really antsy on the flight, just wanting to be done. Um, but we eventually got there. Couple things. Yeah, England's known for bad food. I wouldn't call it necessarily bad, but it was definitely unremarkable, other than the fact that I'm remarking on it. Maybe it'd be better to say it was just incredibly average. Nothing stood out about it. So yeah, interesting that they're known for their bad food. I wouldn't really call it bad, just meh. Next up, the accommodations were very interesting and very unique. Here my experience with hotels is that everything's kind of a concrete box, cookie cutter type thing. The room you're in is exactly like the one next door, and is exactly like the one in the other state. There's just really no variation to them, and you really know what to expect, whether for good or bad. The accommodations there, every place was very unique. I suspect it probably has something to do with the history and the age of the buildings, and buildings getting reused for multiple purposes over time. And there may be some zoning involved where they can't tear down old buildings, perhaps, I'm guessing. But all the buildings were, all the hotels were all really unique. The rooms were each one very different. One of them I actually stayed on was actually a boat. Didn't ever go anywhere. It was permanently docked, but it was floating on water. So yeah, the accommodations were kind of interesting, not knowing exactly what you're going to get each night. One thing that was kind of weird for me was the electrical outlets. Of course, they're 220, I think, 240, something like that. That wasn't a surprise. But what I wasn't expecting and didn't know about until I got there was each electrical outlet has its own switch on it, which is a little bit different than what we have here in the States. I think they're also independently fused. I think everyone has their own fuse on it. And here we have a fuse for the entire circuit, and the only shut-off is at the circuit breaker. So I'm not quite sure why they designed it that way. I know their outlets are designed for safety. They have interlocks on them, so you can't shock yourself plugging in or pulling out. But I'm not sure why the switches and why the independent fuses. It's just kind of a difference in how the electrical codes evolved over time, I suppose. Another interesting thing that I found was the door handles were at, for me, an odd height. Here, door handles are usually kind of waist high, and there they were more chest high, which again was kind of, I'd never heard of that, never realized that before, and found that a little bit unusual. Nothing good or bad, just different. Um, I, we did we I was working with a coworker that lived there, and he was kind of escorting me around to the different customer sites. And on one day, I remember we had about a 400 mile trip that we had to go from one place to the other, and it was short enough. It was too short to fly, and so we ended up driving. It was basically an interstate road trip. And we stopped for gas at one point, and we were filling up. And I went in to grab a Coke. It was a little convenience store, kind of gas station. And I went in to get a Coke, and the gal behind the counter had an accent so thick I could not understand a word she said. The entire transaction, I was just smiling and nodding and did the transaction, and I had no clue what she said. It was kind of hilarious. And we got in the back in the car and started down the road. And he said made some comment about how thick her accent was, and I just started cracking up, saying, "Yeah, I didn't understand a single word she said." Only place that I've ever talked to somebody that was speaking English, supposedly, that I couldn't understand. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people with accents that, English is a second language, and don't really have a big problem understanding them. But that one person that was supposedly speaking English, yeah, didn't catch a word. One thing about that trip and a couple other days driving around that really impressed me was the countryside. It was just absolutely gorgeous. I think it was probably springtime when I was there, and so the hills were just covered in green grass, and with the rock walls separating all the fields, and it really was a pretty country, the area that I was in. And yeah, finally, talking about the rock walls, the whole area was just steeped in history, as I think I mentioned a couple days ago on one of these videos. Here where I'm at in the Western United States, history, Western civilization goes back 250 years, kind of maximum, and we just don't have a rich history here in terms of like architecture and buildings and things like that. And there, the buildings were just mind-blowing to me. The ages. The coworker I mentioned, I stayed with him one night with him. He and his wife's house, and their house was, I think, 500 years old. And for 300 of those years, it had been the local tavern, the pub, and it was just kind of, like I said, mind-blowing to me that this type of building is just kind of run-of-the-mill. It wasn't anything terribly special in terms or unique in terms of the buildings in the area. Everything in the whole neighborhood where he was at, all the houses were kind of that same age that were all around him, and that was something that was just, I still have trouble comprehending. I mean, I know it, I understand it, but experientially, it doesn't compute still for me. So that was really interesting, just seeing that old house. He was in Wales where he lived, and so it was kind of the traditional old Welsh rock construction with double wall construction. So the walls were like 3 feet thick on the exterior walls, and even some of the interior load-bearing walls were that thick, and the doorways were probably 5.5 feet. So I mean, you had to like duck literally to get through the doors. And of course, with the walls so thick, it was almost like going through a hallway, just going through the doorway. And nothing was square. Awful lot of hand built. The doors, were obviously hand constructed, and it was just really cool. That this is just somebody's house that they bought off the open market. Anything around here would be on a state park and government owned, and no private person would be owning anything like that around here. So it was just kind of a real interesting trip in that regard, and kind of expanding my mind in terms of the history of different places. So that's it for today, and England and Wales. Tomorrow we'll go somewhere else. Until then, go make something. Perfection's not required, fun is.